Okay, we are recording. Sue, I didn't notice if you mentioned about people being able to add their questions to the chat box.
I briefly said that, and
okay, good.
you can type it in, and I'll either read it off at the end or answer it as we go.
Good.
Or stop as we go.
Excellent. All right. So my name is Dave Bressler. I'm with Stroud Water Research Center. As Sue mentioned, this presentation is kind of part of a series that we've been doing, Darby Creek Valley Association's Watershed 101. And I am going to talk today about Model My Watershed, just kind of a bit of an introduction to the platform. Not going to go into a lot of detail. There's various resources to support anyone that wants to go in more depth into the program. And I'm also going to I hope that we can spend some time kind of learning the tool, but also concentrating on this Darby Creek Headwaters region and tuning into the influence of urbanization on our streams. Urbanization or development, or whatever you want to call it, is the primary issue in this watershed, as well as this general region of the state, southeastern PA. Urbanization is the main kind of influence affecting stream health. So just an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to introduce, well, what is Model My Watershed? And then I'm going to talk about what the options are, kind of an overview of what the options are, what the functions are of it. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to get into a case study here of the Darby Creek Headwaters and kind of talk about the context of that watershed as it being sort of an urbanizing or urban watershed. So our goals are to, for everyone who's attending, I'm hoping that everyone will understand the basics of Model My Watershed when we're done here. And actually, I'm going to stop my video too, so that I'm not on the recording. That the basics of Model My Watershed are going to mean just how to use the basic functions and starting to try to develop an understanding of how the results can be used and help you all to understand your watersheds. And then, as I mentioned, hopefully folks will have a better understanding of how development and urban activity, roads, have an influence on streams. So this is, take note of this basic shape. You're going to be seeing this multiple times through the presentation here today. This is the Darby Creek Headwaters region that Lauren and Sue and Darren LeBrake and I have been kind of putting together a monitoring project for. You can see the sites here. This is down here in the corner is basically where this Darby Creek Headwaters connects with Little Darby Creek and another stream. I can't remember what the name of it is, but continues Darby Creek down through towards the city, and Darby Creek ultimately ends up going into the Delaware River.
Just to give people a little bit more perspective, this is out on 252 area, and Newtown Square is kind of down near the bottom area and off to the right, just to give people a better idea of the location.
Good, thanks, Sue. And then we've got Highway 30 up in this region here. Okay, so getting into just some basics of Model My Watershed. Model My Watershed is a watershed modeling web app that enables users to investigate land use and soil data, stormwater and water quality impacts, and it also allows you to assess the influence of conservation practices. Model My Watershed is a tool within the Wiki Watershed toolkit. So within the Wiki Watershed toolkit is not only Model My Watershed, but Monitor My Watershed, which has a bunch of sites across the country that are reporting mostly real-time data from sensor stations that are placed in streams. There's a lot in the Delaware Basin that are collecting data right now. Sue and Lauren both have these stations that are reporting data to Monitor My Watershed. Enviro DIY is a community of do-it-yourselfers who are building sensor stations, many of which feed data into Monitor My Watershed. The Leaf Pack network is also slowly being integrated into contributing data to Monitor My Watershed. The Leaf Pack network basically just is a process to sample macroinvertebrates. You take a bag of leaves and put it in the stream, let it colonize with bugs, take the leaf pack out, count and identify bugs, and incorporate them into an index that will tell you about the health of your stream. Macroinvertebrates.org is a really nice new taxonomic website with super clear, very detailed, close-up photographs of lots of different aquatic insects. It's an excellent resource if you want to learn your insects. And then there's the Water Quality mobile app, which is essentially a phone app that allows you to record stream data such as macroinvertebrate data, water quality data, physical habitat data, and take photos and coordinates of your site. So Model My Watershed. The tutorial today, I'm going to go to Wiki Watershed and just kind of give a quick visual overview of that. I'm going to go to the Runoff Simulator, which is kind of embedded in Model My Watershed. It's an educational tool, and then we'll spend most of the time on Model My Watershed. So the Runoff Simulator is an educational tool, and it basically just allows you to understand how, when precipitation falls on the landscape, how that water behaves according to what type of land use it's falling on, and according to what type of soil is underneath. So I'm just going to click on this quickly. We'll go in there and I'll just demonstrate it very quickly here. So what we have is a plot of land, a square plot of land, and we have 5 centimeters of precipitation falling, and it just divides that precipitation up into how much of that is going to go to evapotranspiration, that's going to evaporate or be used by the trees and go back into the air, how much of that is going to go to runoff, and how much of that is going to go into the soil as infiltration, how much is going to infiltrate into the soil. So what you can do with this toggle is you can adjust the amount of rainfall. So if I go up, you can go way up to super high amounts of precipitation and you see the associated numbers change, or you can go down to low precipitation. So if I put it back in the middle, what you can also do is change the land cover. So if we go down to a more natural type of land cover, you're going to see that more is infiltrated. If we go to a high developed land use, you can see that less is infiltrated and more goes to runoff. Okay. You can also change the soil types down here. So we have a high infiltration soil here. So it's as if these houses here were built on soil that is like a sponge where it really absorbs the water well. Now, if we change that soil to a very slow infiltration soil, we'll see that it causes even more runoff. So you see there, not only is there a lot of impervious surface, that is hard surface that will not infiltrate the water, but there's also denser soil that is not going to allow the water to enter it. So that means more runoff. So that's a basic concept of how Model My Watershed sort of works. So I'll go out of there and I will move on to Model My Watershed. So this is just a quick overview of how Model My Watershed functions. You can use it for mapping and analysis. So you get maps of land use and soils and other layers that you can just inspect visually. Or you can use there are summaries that are available to tell you, for instance, how much urban land use is in my watershed. You can also look at actual watershed boundaries. And there are detailed stream maps that you can also investigate. And then another more sophisticated function of Model My Watershed is the actual modeling options, which allow you to either change the land uses that are currently on the landscape and then see how those changes will affect water quantity and quality. So for instance, what would happen to water quantity and quality if my forested watershed was developed? So we have forest moving to a sort of a low density developed area. And it'll give you the actual changes in water quality and quantity that would be associated with that. If you were anticipating a development happening in your watershed, you could use that to kind of look into how the water quantity and quality is going to change. This is just a figure here showing kind of, and we'll get into this more in the tutorial, but I'm just changing the land use in these different areas. These are all wooded areas. So I sort of did a little experiment here and added in, if all of these areas changed over to developed areas, how would that change the water quality at the downstream point here of the watershed? And then you can also add conservation practices. So BMPs, best management practices, rain gardens, vegetated basins, porous paving. You can experiment with putting those types of features into areas that may already be developed. So for instance here, these types of swales and rain gardens, you can model putting those in, and then you see, okay, I put those in, now how much does that improve my water quality and reduce my water quantity? So same thing here, you draw those in on your map, and then it'll model that information and give you a feed out on what the water quality and quantity will be. So just returning to this map, I'm going to go in now into Wiki Watershed, and then we'll go to Model My Watershed, and I'm going to delineate, I'm going to trace out this exact watershed in Model My Watershed. So I'm going to click here.
And just so people know, this is when we say it's an app, it's not necessarily a phone app. You can use it, just type in that website and you'll be able to pull it up. It's not like you have to download it to your phone or anything like that.
Thanks, Sue. That's a great point. It is called an app, but it functions much better on your computer. So this is Wiki Watershed. So you see it's just wikiwatershed.org. You've got tabs up here that allow you to go into different topic areas. I'm not going to go into detail of Wiki Watershed. You can certainly go there and play around with it yourself, but we see here the same panels that I had in the slide with the different tools within the Wiki Watershed toolkit. So what I'm going to do is click on Launch the Model My Watershed app, and then we have that screen that comes up. It's kind of an introductory screen that gives you, again, a little bit of information about the product. And then you have your layers here. You can use this feature, this bar here feature, just like in a program like Google or Google Maps or Google Earth or whatever. You can type in a location, it'll take you there. So I'm just going to press Get Started. And then that takes us into more of our working screen. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to our study area, which is the Darby Creek Headwaters. So I'm going to go to Waterloo Mills, You can see once you've typed an address in there, it kind of automatically pops up. So I've gone there before. So Waterloo Mills is kind of just a location that's kind of in the middle of the Darby Creek Headwaters watershed. So I'm going to click on that, and it takes us there. So if we zoom out, we can see where we are in the landscape. Here we are in southeastern Pennsylvania. We zoom in. I'm using the wheel on my mouse. You can also use these tabs down here. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through these different options that we have for different maps that we can display. Okay, so on this first tab here, and you'll notice if it's blue, then one of these layers is turned on. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through a few of them here. I'm not going to get to all of them because there's a lot of detail here, and we just don't have enough time. So I'm just going to stick to the basic stuff. So what we have here is a course level stream network. So it's just showing the medium and big streams that are available. This layer is available for the whole country. So if I zoom out, we see that this layer covers all of Pennsylvania as well as surrounding states across the country. Okay, and it'll get more detailed as you zoom in. We can see. We see the Schuylkill there. Then we zoom in further, and then we see Darby. We see Darby here. So here's the Darby Creek Headwaters, comes down here. Little Darby comes in, and then we come down further and further and further. Come down through the city. And then we get into the tidal area, John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, and then it comes into the Delaware River.
And just to give another point of reference, the Cobbs Creek, if you can actually follow that down, David, and show that it merges with the Darby Creek, and actually Cobbs Creek is one of Darby Creek's largest tributaries, where it joins in at for us.
Good. So I'm going to zoom back in to our headwater area, and then I'm going to click off this layer, and I'm going to turn on this more detailed layer. Note this is a Delaware River Basin high resolution stream network. So this is much finer detail, and this is going to show the little tributaries coming in. And we'll even show tributaries where they don't exist, because in this region, where we've had a lot of development over the years, a lot of these tiny headwater streams are piped, and they're underground, and there are actually houses and buildings sitting on top of them. Okay, so you see a lot more detail here, and we can see up here in these headwater areas, this is the highway right here. So this is all, according to the map, there are streams here, but these are all very likely to be just piped underneath the ground. So you wouldn't see a channel if you went to this area stream. You wouldn't see an above ground stream if you went.
And also that since it is the beginning of the headwaters, it might only be a little trickle, and you might see more of a stream during a storm because the water is, the soil is super saturated there. And
Great point, Sue. Great point.
Necessarily a running stream.
Yeah, these, you know, as I think most of us know, streams are not necessarily flowing all the time, and the farther upstream you go, the more intermittent and ephemeral streams may be. So these channels may only flow with water during high flow events, and some of those channels may be these little fingers that are indicated on this map. So the rest of the features here on this tab are nutrient and sediment related. So these are concentrations, modeled concentrations of nutrients and sediment in these different areas. This is far beyond, I think, what we want to get into today, but you're welcome to check those out. It gives modeled levels of different nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, and then sediment in these different watersheds. So I'm going to move over to the next tab. And what we have in here at the first the first one here is a very useful layer, National Land Cover Database. And what that is all of these land uses, the whole landscape is categorized according to different land uses. So you can adjust the transparency of this layer. I'm going to make it totally not transparent so we can see it real clearly. This eye here gives you the legend. So we see that all of the reddish type land uses are urban land uses, developed, meaning they're high intensity, can be commercial, can be high intensity apartment buildings, can be industrial land use. Medium density residential is more just denser housing units. Low intensity and open space developed land are properties with lots of grass, but they are developed. They do have houses. And then we see the green, as you might expect, is forest. And then we have the brown and the yellow type colors that represent agricultural type land uses. So those are the main land uses that we're working with in this region. So if we zoom out, we can see that there's quite a bit of forest, quite a bit of pink and red, and we have a bit of agriculture around too. Another layer that's available here is the soils layer. So if we click on the legend here, that we see that the soil, you don't get the soil names, you just get a description of how well they infiltrate water. So high infiltration means it's like sandy type soil that when water falls on it, it's going to go right through. It's going to be like a sponge, like a dry sponge. Whereas very slow infiltration is going to be more like clay soils. They're going to be super dense and they're not really going to be able to absorb water very well. Other layers we have here include elevation. So in our region, we don't have dramatic elevation changes. You can see as we zoom out, a little bit higher elevation as we go north. We zoom out more and more and more, and you start to see higher elevation as you get into central Pennsylvania. Zoom out more and more, and you can see the whole country, and then you see where the real high elevations are. Out in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. So we'll zoom back in to our region, and we see that we also have slope. We don't need to emphasize this a lot, but this is basically just the gradient that the streams are following, how steep the streams are. And again, you can see steeper slopes in central PA, so on. Monthly precipitation. Again, you're not going to see much variation in our general region, but as we zoom out, you can see differences. You can see more rain in central PA, a lot more rain up in New York and closer to the Great Lakes, and then more out. I guess it's less, excuse me. You get more out here in the Northwest, so on. So we'll zoom back in, and we have temperatures as well. Again, we can't see much temperature variation in our region. It does look like it gets a little different down here, closer to Philly. You can see a little bit cooler as you go north and west. Okay. And you do have legends for all these. And then we do have a protected lands layer here. I don't want to spend too much time on all these layers, but these are all the protected lands in the watershed. So these can be useful for just identifying areas that may have good forested land cover, for instance. So a lot of these other layers are, again, specialty layers that you can investigate on your own if you like. There's some urbanization data there. There's also nutrient, nitrogen and phosphorus, and sediment information there. So I'm going to click off protected lands, and I'm going to move on to the next tab. What we have here is a lot of different data layers. These hucks are essentially, they are just watersheds, standard watersheds that are delineated by developed by USGS. The bigger the number, the smaller the watershed. Okay. And then we have county lines. So you've got your counties in there. You've got your congressional districts, and you've got school districts. Okay, so move on to this spot. The only layer that we have right now in this particular category of point observations is weather stations. You can see there are a few weather stations distributed around that you can access. And then the last layer here is just our base maps. So we have here is we just have our streets layer on right now. We can add satellite layer. This is a very similar layer to the same satellite coverages that you get in Google Earth or Google Maps. You can click on satellite with roads, which is a useful layer. You get the roads overlaying on the satellite.
Dave, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute. One of the things that's very interesting about this, especially in the lower part of our watershed, is you might go right to your street and it was saying that there's a stream there, but because, as we mentioned before, it's underground, you actually might have a pipe going through your backyard that's underground where a stream is actually located.
Yeah, and so you can use, you can just use this stream layer, and then you just use your eyes and scan the landscape, and then, possibly foot reconnaissance of a watershed, it can be super informative. So you can just use this type of information to guide you in going out and really getting firsthand experience of what's happening in your watershed. And then we have the terrain layer here, which gives you a little bit clearer view of some of the topographic lines and stuff like that. So I'm just going to go back to the streets view. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to go into the modeling feature here of the tool. And so I'll first, you can, what these different tabs here on the left allow you to do is define an area and then summarize information that applies to only that area. So so some of these layers that we have here, you can choose one of these ways to define the area and then get those particular types of data summarized for that particular area. So you can use any of these different boundaries that we had to define your area of study, or you can hand draw an area, or you can delineate the actual watershed. So that means just tracing out the watershed boundary. So for what we're going to do here, we can see our Darby Creek Headwaters watershed starts right here. So this is the watershed. I'm just going to trace it with my mouse. So it comes up here, around here, up here, out here, and down, and then around, and out here, and here. So that process years ago was a really time-intensive process. You could spend weeks delineating a watershed by hand, and even when GIS came about, it was still a really complex process. These days, all we have to do is click a button. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose to delineate using the Delaware high resolution layer. I take that and I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm just going to drop this point right here. And what it's going to do, it's going to take a couple seconds, and it delineates, it traces out that watershed that I just traced with my mouse in a couple seconds. And now what you have here on the left is the information about the watershed summarized. So it takes this information that we have here and tells you that information and how it applies to this particular area. So we get some information about stream length and stream size here. Small streams are lower orders, bigger streams are higher orders. then we have the land. Now, this is an important tab here. So I'm going to go to this tab, and I'm going to turn on my layer. So these colors here correspond to the colors here. So what this watershed boundary has done is it has summarized how much of each of these different types of land uses are found in this watershed. So what we see by this summary graph here is that the majority of the urban land, the majority of the developed land is open space. So that's, that's low density housing developments basically. Same thing with the low intensity developed. And then we get down here into the intense urban land uses, which, as we can see, they're kind of scattered throughout, but mostly up here in this kind of highway corridor up here. So we see that the start of Darby Creek is not great. It starts, it's flowing out of pollution, basically. When you have activity, human activity, you have pollution, especially when you have heavy asphalt and concrete development with all kinds of pollutants coming in from those sources. So we see that that's not a great start for the stream, but it does end up flowing through more forested areas, and there are some preserved forested areas here. We see also that these data that are presented here are in tabular form, and that you can download these data. So then we also have the data summarized by the soil groups as well. And we see that there's kind of slow infiltration in most of the soils. But you can see that this soil layer is not actually complete for this watershed. So you have to keep that in mind. And then some of these other tabs, just elevation and slope information, some climate information, some point source information, animals. This is done on a county level. And then we have water quality. So this is the water quality that we can look at in this Model My Watershed tool is nitrogen, phosphorus, and suspended sediment. There are certainly plenty of other water quality issues, plenty of other water quality stressors that come from urban lands. Some of those are associated with some of these, like nitrates, nitrogen from urban landscapes often are associated with pesticides. People throw fertilizer down on their lawns and there's pesticide built into the fertilizer. So you get high nitrate, you get high pesticides in the stream. Sediment also carries pollution with it. A lot of these pollutants attach to sediment particles and they're washed into the stream. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get into the modeling exercise here. So
David?
What's that?
David, this is Terry Cook. And if you'd allow an interruption, if you make a mistake in the process that you just showed us of delineating the watershed and then creating the marker, how do you undo it?
Well, I think it depends on what type of mistake you're talking about. I think that's basically a question you should just kind of go in there and, kind of experiment with it. The back arrow often just works.
Okay.
It can be quirky, and that's a good question to kind of talk a little bit about, not to go too much on a tangent, but Model My Watershed, as well as all of the other Wiki Watershed tools, are pretty much constantly in development. So Model My Watershed is one of the longer standing tools, so it really has had a lot of the quirks worked out of it, but there are still things that could be improved.
Okay, and related question, just to clarify, in order to correctly define a watershed, you need to do the two separate steps of first delineating it by hand and then creating the marker point?
No, I just did that delineation by hand just to sort of trace it out, just to show, just to walk through. No, all you have to do is just drop that point and it automatically delineates it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I see we are at 12:43, so I better keep moving here. So this monitor tab, just to briefly mention this, this is simply a tool you can type into this screen here, and it will search records and bring up data that apply to your key term that may be applicable to this study region. Okay, so but I'm not gonna dwell on that. So we are on. There's two different models we can use. The site storm model models a 24-hour storm. So you can change land use, introduce conservation practices, and it'll tell you how those changes to the landscape influence water quality and quantity. I'm not even going to get into the watershed multi-year model today. That is another thing. It's not necessarily any more complex than the site storm, but just for time, I think we can only really get into one of these, and I think the site storm is really going to be more applicable and more usable. So I'm going to click that, and when we click that, what it does is it automatically gives you a readout of water quantity and water quality. Okay, so what it did is it just modeled the area that I delineated according to the existing land use. And so what we see is that in a 0.98 inch storm, you get 0.2 inches of that goes to evapotranspiration, you get 0.1 inch that goes to runoff, and you get 0.7 inches that are infiltrated into the ground. Now, just like with the runoff simulator, I can increase the storm size. So I increase that to 4.6 inches, and what do we see? With a bigger, more intense rain, there's more runoff, okay? So I'm going to put it back down to about 2 inches. And what I'm going to do now is you can bring in other scenarios. So I'm going to add changes to this area with this tab. So I click that. And what it brings up is we can change land cover, or we can introduce a conservation practice. So what I am going to do is first I will change the land cover. So I'll click that, and I'm going to do a dramatic change. So I'm going to do high developed land use. And what it allows me to do is just trace in blocks of land that would be converted. So what I'm going to do is just choose the green areas. So that is the forested areas. And imagine that we're converting all those forested areas to high intensity developed land. Okay. So there's one. Just go in and get another. We'll do this area here. And you can see I can bring in other types of land use. So maybe I'll do some medium developed too. So I'll click here, develop this forested land with medium developed. I'll do another medium developed, or I'll do another high developed up here. So on, and maybe I'll do another medium developed up in here. Okay, so now, what would you all expect that type of development to do? How would that affect this watershed? So it's taking forested land and converting it to developed land, to urban land. So what would be the expectation? Well, let's see. I'm going to compare. So if I press this button here, compare, it brings up 3 scenarios. So it brings up, well, what if my watershed was totally forested? And then we have the current conditions, and then we have my modifications. So we see that with my modifications of bringing in more urban land use, it increases the runoff and decreases infiltration. Okay? And then it has them broken up into their separate categories. So decreased evapotranspiration, increased runoff, and decreased infiltration. So that's the impact that urban land has. It creates more runoff, it creates more flooding, it creates more damage through severe flashy flows. What about water quality? I click on this tab. Okay, so we see in a predominantly forested watershed, there is very little sediment. We're in total suspended solids, i.e. sediment, dirt. In our current conditions, you see there's quite a bit of sediment already compared to a forested area. And then you add on the increased urban land and you get even more sediment. Moving down to nitrogen, which is a very abundant stressor in urban areas because of all the lawn application and other sources. You see that nitrogen also goes up. And the same for phosphorus. Okay. And we can change the rain levels. Okay. And that we see how that changes things.
Dave, I'm just going to interject for a minute.
Yes.
Once again, you can take this down to a smaller area. Doesn't even have, it could just be your neighborhood.
Yeah, and why don't I do that, Sue? Why don't I go ahead and for this conservation practice demonstration, why don't I go here? So I use the back arrow and I'm gonna go to change area. And what I'll do, why don't I zoom in to one of these developed watersheds? Why don't I go into this one, which seems to be all neighborhood. So this is all sort of low density residential. Or I could, why don't I go here? I'm going to turn on the satellite so I can see what it looks like. So yeah, why don't we do this stream? Now let's do this stream right here.
All right, Dave, just remember to keep an eye on the time, all right?
Yes, 10 minutes. I think this next demo should take about 5 minutes. So
Okay. We have a couple of questions we need to get through too.
okay, good. So let me just go ahead and delineate this little watershed here. Okay. So there's that watershed. Now I'm going to click on the land use. And so we see that it's almost all developed land. So I'll click that off. And what I'm going to do is click this model button again, go to the site storm model, and I'm going to add changes. And then I'm going to go to the conservation practice. So I'm going to add in a bunch of rain gardens. So as Sue said, you could do this on a micro level, going into each person's backyard and doing a lot of different rain gardens. I'm just going to do like some bigger chunks just for the sake of time. So there's a big rain garden. Let's do a vegetated basin. So maybe I'll just do a vegetated basin here. And then maybe what other conservation practice? Why don't we do some green roofs? This is very coarse right now, but okay, so we've added in those conservation practices. So when you do that, we have this all developed land, but what happens if we add conservation practices? If we add ways that you're going to increase water infiltration and reduce runoff, how are these going to help that? Well, we're going to go to compare again. And what do we see? Well, I put in pretty big infiltration basins and a lot of rain garden area, and we see that it has dramatically reduced infiltration. Excuse me, increased infiltration and dramatically reduced runoff. Okay. If we go to water quality, we see the same thing. It has dramatically reduced sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now, I went super big with these. That's probably way more of the landscape than you would normally address with these conservation practices. But nonetheless, that's an example of how you can play around with this and model different scenarios to determine, well, okay, we're going to put in this many rain gardens in our neighborhood that are this size. How is it going to affect things? Okay, so that's pretty much Model My Watershed. You can store projects, you can rename your different scenarios that you've created. and you can go to, you have your account settings and other things in there, but I feel like I just need to stop right now. There's a lot of help resources, so I'm going to go back to the presentation just to reference the help resources that are available, and then we will be done. So here we have the help resource, Here we have the help resources. So this is a really good help page. There is extensive technical documentation. There are videos, basically recordings like we're doing today, that are available. And there are actually curricula as well that are available for anyone, but they were designed for teachers to use. Okay, so that's what I have. What questions do we have, Sue? I will stop my share.
I apologize. I was on mute and I was talking and you guys couldn't hear me.
Oh,
So first I'm gonna, Hugh Roberts does ask a question. He's in the lower watershed.